So, you are here to talk about launching your anxious teenager into the world. Um, and the good news is, even if your child is not an anxious teenager, these tips are great for launching any teenager into the world. So, I'm thrilled that you're here. I'm thrilled. This is my favorite thing to talk about in the entire world. So, thanks for being here to be part of it. So, why don't we start off with talking about why you are here? You are here because you are part of a really big club. I am too. So welcome to the really big club. 1 in 3 adolescents between the ages of 13 and 18 not might, not could, but they will experience not an episode of anxiety, but something significant enough that a medical professional would diagnose it as an anxiety disorder. So that's 1/3 of our kids will experience something significant enough that we would call it a disorder. I would say that 100% of kids and 100% of human beings will experience anxiety. It is a normal part of being human, but some of them are going to experience it much more significantly, and those are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. It's not only a really big club, it's a club that seems to be getting bigger all the time. This data that I've got on this slide comes from the National Institute of Health, and it's some of the more recent. But the most recent thing I found ended with 2013 that said we've experienced a 20% increase in the last few years. I would be willing to venture that we've experienced an even bigger increase since 2013. And what I tend to tell everyone that I work with, everyone that I talk to, that anxiety's best friend is depression. So it's really hard to talk about anxiety without talking about depression. They tend to go hand in hand. A lot of people think that that's a surprise when they say, oh, and I also have experienced depression too. It's not a surprise. Again, very normal. Tends to happen with anyone who struggles with anxiety. They're going to have some struggles with depression. So when I'm talking about anxiety, I also look at things like suicidal ideation. And you can see that the hospital rate for teenagers who are thinking about harming themselves has doubled in the past 10 years. And I would be willing to bet that you would be hard pressed to find any of those children who were hospitalized who did not say they had struggled with anxiety. We're talking about launching. I don't have tons of great data on kids who go straight from high school into the workforce or high school into the military. I couldn't find that data, but I can find there's a ton of data on kids who go from high school into college. But I think the experience is somewhat the same in that 63% of college students have reported that they've experienced significant anxiety. Overwhelming anxiety was the word. Overwhelming anxiety in the past year. When you ask college students, 63% of them say that. 23% of them have actually sought treatment. So those numbers right there, you may be thinking, geez, 23% went for treatment. That's a lot. And it is. It's a lot. But what jumps out at me in those numbers is that 63% were struggling and only 23% actually got help and went out and tried to find help. So one of the key things that I'm hoping we can talk about in this presentation today is how do we get that number a little higher? How do we make sure that the kids who, when they are experiencing that overwhelming anxiety, know what to do and know to go get help? As I said, the data that we have is mostly about college. And what we do know is that first year that when they start college is the toughest. They're really at a high risk when they go from home and high school to a college setting. And what we've seen is that first semester, as the semester goes, their anxiety goes. Their anxiety builds and builds and builds over time. And then what doesn't happen, unfortunately, is it never drops. builds up in the first semester, it reaches a high level, and then that stays at that high level for the second semester. It typically doesn't have a period of drop until after they finish their entire first year of college. So the first year of college is tough. I'm sure that isn't a surprise to anyone who's done it, or if you just think about it, that the fact that they're leaving home, they're leaving everything they've known, and the academic rigor, the requirements, it's a lot. And if you already struggle with anxiety, it's a tough time. You've probably heard the saying, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. I remember people telling me that when I had little kids, and I was like, what do you mean? My kids, these problems are big, and you just don't know until you're there. But the reason they say that is because it's true. And the reason it's true is because it has everything to do with their brains. So it's hard to talk about teenagers or anxiety without talking a little bit about the brain. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of just what I mean by that, and then we'll jump into the tips. But basically, teenage years, adolescence, huge period of brain growth and development. There's a ton of things going on in those amazing brains of theirs. And it's a ton of wonderful stuff. They are more likely to try things. They are more likely to come up with unique ideas. They are more creative. They are more socially engaged. They are more passionate. They have enthusiasm. All of those things are a byproduct of all this cool stuff that is happening in the teenage brain. However, if any of you ever watched the show Once Upon a Time, I used to watch it obsessively. I loved Once Upon a Time. And they used to say all the time, magic always has a price. And that is, I love that because it's true. It's a true statement about life. Magic always has a price. Magic of having all this cool stuff in your brain. And truly, guys, if you're watching, you're a parent, you're an adult, we've lost this stuff. And if we could capture just a fraction of what they've got, our lives are richer and more happy and exuberant if we can just capture some of it. So it really is magical. I am not one of those people. Sometimes you'll hear the people who are just like, oh, teenagers. I think teenagers are awesome. They just have so much great stuff going on, but magic comes with a price. The price of all this great stuff in their brain is that they are more willing to do stuff. They're more willing to try stuff. They're more willing to take risks. When you look at risk of dying of a completely avoidable cause, you're more likely to die of something that you could have avoided between the ages of, I think it's 13 and 18. Or maybe it's 13 and 23, actually, now that I think about it. It's the same period of time that your brain is going through all of this amazing development is the same time. And this is why we as parents lose a lot of sleep, parents of teenagers, because we know that they are more social, so they might be friends with somebody that we don't really want them to be. They are more willing to try things, so they might try some things that we don't want them to try that could have lifelong implications or consequences. They're creative. They can come up with stuff that in our wildest dreams we never would have imagined that they would come up with. They're creative. They can lie really well. That is the beauty of the teenage brain and the tragedy of the teenage brain. The other tragedy of the teenage brain, or risk, I should say, is that the way our brains are developed is we have this amazing thing right here in the front of our brain called a prefrontal cortex. And this prefrontal cortex is a huge gift that we humans have that allows us to do things like assess risk, make clear, solve problems with, and come up with clear strategies and come up with options and see lots of different options. It just helps us to strategize and plan. So it's this great, great thing that is not fully developed until we're in our early 20s. You know, some kids, maybe it's 21, some kids may not till 25, but all of that, especially that risk assessment, deciding what's the worst thing that could happen, that funny question that we ask ourselves, teenagers cannot answer that question. They don't know. They really don't. Their brain has not developed to a point where they know what's the worst thing that can happen. That's what they lean on us as parents to do for them, to say, this is the worst thing that can happen. Now, there's a dance that we have to walk as parents, because we tend to be overly negative, they tend to be overly positive, and somewhere in the middle is probably the right answer. But back to the point, they aren't assessing risk. They're willing to try things. Big kids tends to be can result in some big problems and big worries and big fears for us as parents. And then when you layer on top of that a brain that I would just call a very reactive brain, that's what an anxious brain is. And we human beings all operate on a continuum. We all are a range of things. Some of us are more, some of us are less, including how reactive our brain is and how reactive all kinds of things. Some of us have very reactive skin. Some of us have very reactive lungs and we react and have asthma attacks. Some of us have reactive digestive systems. Some of us have food allergies, or there's lots of examples of the ways that we vary in how we react to the world. And anxiety, people who truly struggle with anxiety tend to have reactive brains. So it means that their brains react to stimuli a little more quickly or severely than someone else's brain might. That's all. It's not a life sentence. It's not a tragedy. It just means their brain works a little bit differently. And all anxiety really is at the heart. This is a very simple explanation, but it helps us for this whole conversation to understand that. So we just talked about all this amazing stuff that the prefrontal cortex will do in our brain. Well, we also have what I call the lizard brain, a prehistoric brain. It's something that's just it's a gift from our ancestors. It's sort of centered around, it's back here down at the base of our brain. It's around the amygdala. And what that part of our brain was designed to do was to keep us alive. And it's been around for eons, and it's kept us alive and kept our ancestors alive. Basically, as we were wandering through a jungle somewhere, and there was a predator, say a lion, came up to us and wanted to eat us, that part of our brain was very simple and had one function: keep you alive. And by having one function, it gave you three options to stay alive. It said, you are in extreme danger. I'm going to send signals to your entire body, and I'm going to tell you either to run away as quickly as you can, to fight that tiger, or to freeze in place and try and hide or freeze. So fight, flight, or freeze. That's all the amygdala is designed to do. And when you are experiencing true anxiety, that's what's happening. You have stopped using this really super tool to solve problems and to assess risk and to plan and strategize. You don't have access to that anymore. You have access to a very simple part of the brain that says, run away, fight, or freeze in place. And if you think about your teenager, if you've experienced your teen having true anxiety, you have probably seen all of those. You've seen examples of fight, flight, or freeze. I didn't realize it at first when my teenager would have real dramatic outburst, anger, lots of angry outburst, that was her anxiety. And it was the amygdala saying, fight, flight, or freeze. I'm going to fight right now. I'm going to fight you. So typically when they go with fight, it's with their parents. They're experiencing extreme anxiety and they fight. Flight is just escaping. And yes, sometimes it is a true physical. It's those texts. A lot of parents, myself included, get the text saying, please come check me out. Come check me out. I have to come home, or I can't go to school today. That's flight. That's the amygdala saying, run away. The other way that you see teenagers showing us their flight is when they scroll through their phone. That's their escaping. And they're doing it. Obviously, sometimes they're doing it for fun, but sometimes you can tell the difference when there's a lot of nervous energy and they just are just nervously scrolling through that phone. It's their flight instinct. They are trying to escape into something else except what's going on inside of their body. And the freeze is when they just can't make a decision. And you've seen that too with your teens. They just cannot decide what they want or what they're going to do next. So that's a little bit about the brain and what happens with our teens, all of them. But I can't really talk about any of this stuff without talking about the reality of where we are today. So everything I just said, I could have said in a presentation last year or the year before that, and it's all still true. But now we have this entire new dynamic that we've layered onto the situation of launching our kids. And the kids I'm working with and speaking to, and I'm around because I'm a parent of teenagers, I'm around these kids, and they are going through a lot right now. The class of 2020, it chokes me up when I think about all the stuff that they're experiencing because they are experiencing so much grief. They have been told their entire lives, we build this up, teachers, schools, and parents. We all make graduation, senior prom. This is the culmination. This is a milestone. This is such a big thing that they have been waiting for. And they've watched the classes before them do it, and they've been waiting for their chance, and it's not happening. So they're grieving this loss. They are confused. The entire world is anxious right now. We all are afraid of what the future holds, what this means, and they are picking up that from us. So anxious teens, I will argue, are some of the most perceptive teenagers in the world. So they are totally picking up on all of the anxious vibes all around them and the fears. They also don't know what their future is going to look like, especially the ones who are planning on college. Or actually, I shouldn't say especially, if they were planning on getting a job, they don't know how that's gonna work. If they were planning on joining the military, they're not sure what that's gonna look like. If they were planning on going to college, they don't know. So this is, I would say, probably one of the toughest times to launch a teenager into the world that any parent has ever experienced. So if you are one of those parents, I feel so much empathy and just concern for you, concern for your kids, because this is super, super tough. It's super tough for you. It's super tough for them. So I just wanted to put that out there and be very transparent and open that it's freaking me out probably too as a parent of teens. And it's saddening me as a coach of some parents and talking to some of these teens. It really is a world that when I first started doing these kinds of talks and this kind of information, I thought, I'd lay out all those statistics and say, this is so hard. Look at how many of them have anxiety and how many of them struggle when they go to college. And that was nothing compared to what's happening now. So I just couldn't go on without at least acknowledging that. But let's go back to the slides. So this is where we are. The thing to remember, though, as we go forward, is that you aren't a statistic and neither is your child. So I also want to be sure that that sinks in. Yes, you're part of a big club. Your child's part of a big club if they struggle with anxiety, but Nobody's a statistic, and neither are you, neither is your child, neither am I. As I've said before multiple times, I am the parent of an anxious child as well. You may have seen at the beginning of the presentation on that title page that I have a PhD in psychology. I am a certified life coach. I have mentioned that I do coach parents of anxious kids. I also am around a lot of anxious kids and do some speaking and things with them directly. And what I say to everyone, and what I want to make sure you guys know about this presentation and about the work that I do and about me, is that I don't do this work because I have a PhD in psychology, because I studied this, because I'm a life coach. That is not what drives me. What drives me is my own personal experience as a parent. As a parent of two awesome kids, one of whom who is perfect and gifted and the light of my life, and also has struggled significantly with anxiety. So that is a little bit about who I am and why I do this. I always like to let parents know that this is me talking to you as a fellow parent and someone who has been there, not necessarily just psychologist or a life coach. I'm not a statistic either. So with that being said, let's talk about some tips. So tip number one, again, these are the tips I would have given 3 years ago, and I'm gonna give them the basics, but I'm also gonna try and layer in some information about the situation and the circumstances of where we are today. But the first thing to do as you are thinking about launching your child into the world, and this is true if they're launching in a month or a week or in 2 years or 4 years, we need to take stock of where we are, of where they are. And when I work with parents, I typically help them do this, but you don't need me to help you do this. This is something every parent can do. You just have to look at your child and look at some basic criteria, and either you alone or with your child, try and come up with a basic idea of, are they blowing it out of the park? Are they really, really doing a great job at these things? Or are these areas where they might struggle? So I wrote down a couple of my categories I look at, just because I knew I wouldn't remember them if I didn't write them down. They are things like looking at them in terms of their ability to take care of themselves physically. So put physical as a category and start thinking about all the stuff that goes into taking care of yourself in a physical sense. So that's things like feeding yourself. If you are ill, do you know how to get help? Emotionally is very, very linked to that. Do they know how to care for themselves emotionally and their emotional health? Socially, are they able to speak to strangers? Are they able to make friends? Are they able to ask questions when they need to? Some of our kids with real social anxiety, that's an issue, and that's something we need to first let's take stock of where they are. Look at their spiritual needs, and spiritual can be things like your religious beliefs and your religious background, and if they know how to access that when they launch. If you are not a family of faith or do not practice a faith, every human needs something that helps them feel like they transcend above the ordinary. That's what I mean by spiritual. So maybe they find that transcendent place in nature. Maybe they find it through art, through music. But it is a true human need, and I would include that in when I'm looking and assessing my child as they're launching. Do they know how to do that? Do they know where to get it? A couple other ones that we might forget about: life skills, obviously. Can they cook? Can they do laundry? Can they clean a bathroom? Basic stuff they just need to know. And another one that that we've been doing for so long as adults, we may not remember or realize that our kids really, really need this stuff, is administrative skills. Administrative stuff is huge when they leave home. This is stuff like keeping up with dates, knowing when things are due, and not just a paper for school, but they've got to maybe pay rent or pay bills or um, register for things or fill out forms. I mean, these are basic things that we as parents typically have been doing for them for a long time, and it is time for them to start figuring out how to do for themselves once they leave us. So administrative skills is a big one. A lot of our kids have never addressed an envelope because they haven't had to and don't know how. So don't just assume because it's simple that they know how to do it. You know what else they don't know how to do? I worked at the school store. They don't know how to write checks. Again, they don't really have to, and for most places, a card is all they ever use, but occasionally they're going to come across something that only takes a check, and they need to have a basic idea of what to do to write a check. So administrative skills. So the first tip is to come up with these criteria like I just listed, and just kind of give them a grade. Where are they blowing it out of the water? Where are they struggling a little bit? However, the most important part of this tip is to do something that is completely the opposite of what is our nature. What we are going to want to do when we give them a grade or make an assessment or give them a rating of some sort, the thing we automatically do as humans is look at where are they failing, where are they not doing well, what needs to improve. This is our tendency. This will be our child's tendency if they're part of this exercise, or if you show them these grades. They will immediately focus on the negative. And what I really, really, really want to encourage you to do as you do this assessment is to focus on the positive. And I say that for 3 reasons. So first, obviously, if you use this to go in and say, here's all the places you're failing, little Bobby, that's a terrible experience for Bobby, and it's a terrible experience for you. So focus on the positive will make this not a miserable, terrible thing, a miserable, terrible exercise. Every single one of our kids have areas where they are doing well. Pay attention to those. Notice those. Celebrate them. Compliment your kids on them. It's super important that you do that. Say, hey, I'm just looking at you getting ready for school and what you need to improve on, and I realize you are awesome at life skills. You already know how to cook, you do laundry, you've done all these things. Celebrate and really acknowledge your kids where it's good. It makes it more pleasant. They need to hear these things. The other reason that I say focus on the positive is it's really important that you realize there's a lot of research on this, actually. We think that if we should always be focusing on our weaknesses and building up our weaknesses, when in reality, it's very hard to take a weakness to a place of strength. I would say almost impossible. It is not difficult at all to build on strengths. In fact, people love doing that. If you're good at something, we do it and we enjoy doing it and we get better at it. But to take something that you're not naturally good at and to suddenly become good at it is unusual and unlikely. So what I recommend, instead of trying that approach and instead of trying to say you're not great at these life skills, for example, or you're not great at cooking, so let's spend the next 6 weeks or 2 months or whatever learning to cook. I would say try and find a way to use a strength to offset or to manage some of the weaknesses. That's the way we work best. So an example of something like that would be the kid who isn't great at life skills, and I have one, so it happens. Some of them just, aren't so great at it, but that same child is actually really great in the social area. has always been totally able to talk to strangers, to ask directions, to go in and, order a Coke for himself when he was 4 years old. So that's a skill. It's a gift. It's something he's naturally good at. And I have been reinforcing and telling him he's naturally good at it his whole life. So he's very confident in his social skills. So when he goes to college, I am going to encourage him to build on that strength. When he is unsure at that laundromat how to work the washing machine, ask someone. You're comfortable doing that. So build on the strength. Don't try and, beat them up over their weakness. And the final point about focusing on the positive that's so, so important is our kids right now, as they're launching, this is the time that they need to hear what is good about them. And they need to hear it from us probably more than they have any time in their entire lives. Because as they go out into the world, we just saw the stats. That first year is hard. They are going to hear the ways and see the ways that they don't measure up and they aren't as good. And what they need to have also in their head, very, very strongly reinforced as much as we can, is yes, but I've always been good at this. My mom told me that I have always been a good fill in the blank. They need to carry with them the knowledge that there are things that they are good at, that are their gifts, that are their strengths. We are the ones who tell them who they are right now because they still aren't quite sure. And we have all the evidence that we can point to, and they love that. They love when we tell stories about when you were 4 years old, you did this. You had this gift and you always have. This is the thing as we are launching our kids, it's so super important. And going back to coronavirus, where would I layer coronavirus into this specific tip? I would really layer it into looking at their emotional, when I said, focus on these different categories and where they fall. So their emotional, where they fall out on emotional stability and skills to manage their emotions is going to be really, really key in how well they're going to manage this stuff. It's about flexibility. Some of our kids are super, super flexible. It's actually a gift of being a teenager. Most teenagers are more flexible than we adults are because they can see, and are willing to try new things. So really play to that with them. Yes, we don't know what the future is going to be like, and you are really good at adapting. You're better than I am. And that is truly a true statement from almost all of us about our teenagers. They are better at adapting than we are. We just have to be very careful with our own mindset and our own beliefs as parents, because we are projecting. And like I said, the anxious ones pick up on every thought and every feeling we're having. They know. So be very clear on your own fears and your own concerns and work on those for yourself so that you aren't projecting them onto your kids. And you have to spend some time talking to them about their mindset, what they're believing. Some of the things they're thinking and believing are not necessarily true. This is the end. This is terrible. This will never be okay. Those are thoughts that you need to help them challenge. Someone I was having, as we all have, a little bit of a meltdown about the whole situation and where we are and what's happening in the world with my coach. And my coach said to me, Tanya, you act as if there was a time when you knew exactly what was going to happen tomorrow. That has never been true. So this is actually, yes, there are a lot of different scenarios and new things playing out, but there has never been a time that the future was certain. Your kids are better at dealing with that than you are. So explain, talk about it, give them a venue to talk about it, give them a venue to express their grief. I would say that's the foundational piece. Let them feel the grief. And when they express grief in terms of anger, and outrage, let that be okay. Be a safe place where they can be outraged and angry. Okay, tip number 2, once you've done this assessment and you've looked at where there are some places where they can improve, our tendency as parents is to jump in with both feet. And what I would say, and what I tell my clients all the time when we're doing this kind of an exercise, is whatever it is you're thinking about doing, you've identified an area where your child needs to improve their life skills, or your child has got to get some skills for self-care, or your child has got to improve their physical health, or whatever it is that you've decided. You've come up with an idea for how you want to improve it. Cut that in half, and then cut it in half again. And then you are probably in the ballpark of what you should actually try. What you don't want to do, as I said with the whole assessment, is this should not be a tool to beat your kid up or to make them feel bad about themselves. And you trying to help them definitely should not be something that makes them feel bad about themselves. It has to be something that they feel they can manage. And typically what they feel they can manage is less than what you think it is when you're trying to improve them. So let's just take the example of they don't know how to cook at all. If they don't know how to cook at all, you can say, I'm going to teach them how to cook. I'm going to teach them to cook an entire meal. Okay, that's your first plan. Cut that in half. Let's teach them how to cook one dish. Let's cut that in half again. Let's teach them how to do one element of making one dish. Maybe it would be shopping for the dish. Maybe it would be chopping the vegetables for the dish. But just that one piece. And you will not get the resistance that you will get from your child. If you say, you're going to learn how to make my special dish, you might get some resistance. But if you said, I'd love for you to chop these vegetables, and that's all. It's just like this little tiny turtle on the slide who's climbing up a whole staircase. You've got to take little tiny manageable steps. An anxious brain will quickly go from up here to down here into a state of overwhelmed panic, fight, flight, or freeze. They will fight you, they will run away from you, or they will freeze in place. So in order not to push our anxious kids into that state, take whatever you're thinking and make it as small as you possibly can. The other thing we can do as parents is we can also become overwhelmed when we look at the assessment and say, well, there's so much stuff, I don't even know where to start. So you don't want to do nothing. You do want to pick something. Just find that happy medium, like I said, turtle steps, those tiny little turtle steps for you and for your child. When you approach it that way, both of you will be able to make some progress, more progress than you probably think, because you're going to think, all I did is teach them to chop vegetables, that's not enough. It is more than you realize. And the final tip, and a super important one, is just self-care. Now, while your children are still under your roof and with you, and as we've said up until now, they're stressing out. They would be stressing out even if the world was exactly like it was a year ago, but it's not. They need to figure out multiple ways that they can calm themselves down, that they can get out of fight, flight, or freeze and back into the calm, centered part of them that makes good, wise decisions. The tricky thing about self-care is that there is no one size fits all. This is a very individual thing. And so your child is going to have to try a lot of stuff to find the thing that works best for them. These are a couple examples. These pictures on the slides are some examples of things like exercise, especially exercise outdoors. But if you have a child that hates to run, that's not going to be it for them. That's what I mean about it's got to be tailored. Time outdoors, great. Time with pets, great. Meditation. Meditation is probably one of my top tips. I recommend it all the time, but it is a tough one, especially because here's the but for this tip. You can't start meditating when you are anxious. Um, Typically, you can't start or try to find these tools, any of these tools, when you are in a state of anxiety. As we've said all along, that's the state of fight, flight, or freeze. You are not assessing whether you would like a nice bubble bath. When you are about to be eaten by the tiger, you don't process a whole lot of, well, I'm about to be eaten by the tiger. I wonder what would make me feel better right now. Maybe I should take a bubble bath. That's not how the brain works. The brain is just going to go straight into, I'm angry, I'm going to run away, or I'm going to freeze and not make any decisions. So in order to find these things, you have to start doing them when you aren't anxious. That's the tricky paradox of self-care. You need self-care when you're anxious, but you can't figure out what self-care you need when you are anxious. So it's sort of like having a really awesome tool, say like a lathe. If you don't know what a lathe is, it's one of those things that carves wood. Well, I don't want to figure out how to carve an ornate leg for my table at the moment for the very first time when I'm making the table. I need to have practiced and spent years and years or days and months or whatever figuring out how to use that lathe so that when it's time to make the table, I'm good at it. And that's really the thing about self-care. You want them running or hiking or meditating or doing any kind of fine motor things that sort of engage your brain to a level that it sort of stops your ability to think about other things that freak you out. Those are great, like knitting, embroidery, fine little stuff that involves, like they make friendship bracelets where you tie little knots and patterns. The dot art that's really, really, really intricate, paint by numbers, and those really intricate paint by numbers, stuff like that that helps soothe the anxious brain. And then if you can get them to do those things when they're not anxious, they are their fallback tools when they are anxious. And now, like I said, while they're home with you is a great time to help them find them, help them get good at them, and actually consciously, so we don't always make a conscious connection when we find something that is soothing. We think we like it, but we don't realize, oh, this is something I can do when I feel anxious. And that's the conscious connection you need to help them make. You need to help to remind them. Remember, you feel better when you run. Remember, you feel better when you knit. That calms you down. Those hot baths you take calm you down. Swimming calms you down. Remind them of all the things that help calm them down so that, again, your voice is in the back of their head when they leave. And you want that voice to be saying, you're great at this. You've always been good at these things. And here's some things that you already know to do when you are feeling stressed and overwhelmed. So those are the tips. But I do want to point out a couple of really important things before I turn off the presentation and go straight to any questions that you might have. The most important thing to realize that even when you have these tips, unfortunately, things still go wrong. And I write a whole chapter in my book about this. The first most important reason why having this information, writing down if you took notes, reading over your notes afterwards, the reason why it still won't work is because knowing and doing are not the same thing. And sometimes we forget that. I tell a funny story. It's a funny story to me. It's actually a true story that every 10 years or so, I will get enamored with some kind of random workout video. It was a video, many years ago, and then it became a DVD, and now it's become a download, and I'll just go buy something. And I don't do them. I buy them, and I have done this multiple times, but that's the sad truth of it is buying a DVD for Buns of Steel will never give you Buns of Steel. Listening to me talk about how to launch your child will not help you successfully launch your child. You have to, it's the difference between the what and the how. You now know the what. You must now take it to the how. You have to do in order for any of this actually to work. And the doing is the hard part, unfortunately. The other tricky thing or reason why this tends to fall apart or tends not to work is that we sometimes get this crazy idea in life and in parenting both that there's one right way, and I'm going to do it this right way, and it's going to go well. And that is like the most terrible belief to bring to life. Don't believe it. There is no right way to life. And try and instill this in your kids now, because this is such an important thing to know. There is no right way to do this stuff. If you go into it thinking, I've got to do this right, what we tend to do is not get it right and give up or throw up our hands and say, well, I tried, I can't do anything. There is no right way. The way that you've parented up until now, the way that you've gotten through life up until now is you've tried it, you've tried some stuff, it hasn't worked, and you've made a course correction. And that's all launching your child is going to do. It's going to be just like that. It's going to be course correction after course correction. You are going to figure this out, and they are going to figure it out. It is a huge shift to go from them being under your roof and with you to out in the world. And there is not a switch that you flip and say, okay, now you're out in the world, I have nothing to do with you anymore. That's not the way it works. But it's also not going to be the same as when they were under and you knew when they left, what they eat, when they came home. So you are going to have to navigate, and you are going to find at times you are going to go too far in one direction, and in times you'll go too far in the other. Sometimes you're going to be a little too involved and a little too interested and call too often and check in too much and be a little maybe helicoptery about, well, what did you eat? Well, how many? Well, how often? And maybe you're getting a little too far on one direction, so you've got to course correct. Maybe you're going to step away a little too far and maybe not call as often and realize, oh, I need to check in more. That's all this is going to be. It is going to be a constant course correction for both you and your child. Your child is figuring it out. They don't know how much involvement they want from you and how much distance they want from you, just as they have been doing all through adolescence. They have been navigating this weird transition time, and that's what it is. It's a transition for both of you, from them being completely dependent on you for everything to being completely independent in most ways. Although I don't know that they'll ever be completely independent. They are still going to come to you when they have kids. They are still going to come to you when they have issues. So it's never a full independence, but they are navigating that. So you're going to get it wrong. You're going to go too far in both directions, and that's okay. We all get to course correct. So with that, those are I'm looking in the comments. I'm going to stop the recording and